Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. Check-ins. I feel calm, and I have a desire to say something more interesting than calm. Welcome to the Stoa. My name is Peter Lindberg. I'm the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge. And today we have my buddy Benjamin Boyce. It's going to be a good one. He's the one waving right now with the interesting background. So how today's going to work, Raven is going to have a conversation with Ben, and then if you have a question, just throw it in the chat box. If you want Raven to read it on your behalf, just indicate that in the chat box. This will go on YouTube, so if you don't want to be on YouTube, get Raven to read it. That being said, Raven will introduce Ben, and we'll start from there.
Hi, everybody. So Benjamin Boyce is the host of the YouTube channel and podcast, The Boyce of Reason. This channel was critical in documenting the Evergreen meltdown that happened almost 3 years to the day ago and sent him on a trajectory of inquiry that continues to this day. His podcast covers a lot of hot button issues about sex and gender and transitioning and detransitioning. So things that are like very critical topics to be discussing right now, but he does it in such a way that I really respect, and it really relates to some of the issues of mimetic mediation that we've been talking about here at the Stoa. Like, how do we have conversations across ideological bounds? So I'm really excited to have Benjamin here to kind of discuss and reflect on his project of his podcast. So Ben, welcome to the Stoa. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. I did just want to it's the 3-year anniversary of the meltdown, and I thought that maybe we would just, if you had any thoughts or reflections looking back after these last 3 years.
Well, yeah, plenty, but how brief of an overview do I need to give? Is everybody aware of the protest, what happened 3 years ago? Basically, there was a series of protests at the Evergreen State College. The Evergreen State College is a very small liberal arts college in Olympia, Washington. And after the election of Donald Trump, a series of protests erupted on campus that got more and more brazen, that culminated in, it culminated in a week-long series of protests, beginning with the protest of Brett Weinstein, who is the brother of Eric Weinstein. He's an evolutionary biologist. And Brett had been, I guess, arguing against certain methods that the college was implementing to make the college life centered around anti-racism, and he had some qualms with the way in which they were going about implementing equity. And he argued with other faculty and staff about that, and those emails got into the hands of the student journal, the Cooper Point Journal, the student newspaper, and then got into the hands of the protesters. Now, the protesters weren't really intending to protest Brett Weinstein. He was just one example that they wanted to make of a quote-unquote racist faculty. And unfortunately for them, they accused him of many things that were demonstrably untrue about his racism or whatever. And then the protesters went on to take over the administration building, to kind of basically take people hostage, to roam the campus with baseball bats, to assault people who were writing in chalk that they wanted class. And they uploaded and live streamed all of their protests onto the internet. And it shows some of the most egregious behavior that you could probably come across in the 2010s, kind of the social justice activism era that I think we're kind of in a new phase of, though some things are happening on Twitter that seem to want to reboot that stuff. But anyway, so the campus kind of became the laughingstock of the internet for a few weeks, well, for a few months, and became kind of a harbinger for progressivism gone toxic. And that sparked a whole lot, or it was the kind of like the lightning rod for a lot of discussion around what it means to be anti-racist, what it means to be progressive, and what it means to be conservative in these issues. Now, while the internet was roundly mocking the protesters for acting the way that they did, I had been a student there, and I had been kind of on camera for a lot of the lectures and seminars and orientations and workshops that the college was putting on that basically I've argued since that point that the college was setting up the students to act this way. The college was programming students to become radicals and to not be very nuanced with the ways in which they wanted to affect progressivism, and also not really giving them the tools to combat criticism when it eventually came. In fact, the college itself guarded and coddled the protesters before, during, and after the protests. And to this day, the college has still not made amends and or actually apologized or done any thorough review of what actually happened. Anyway, so I had been on camera for a lot of those workshops, and then I went through, because it's a state institution, I got that footage via public records requests, and I began to go through the emails and the videos and present it to the public to try to get a full 360-degree exploration of the causes of the behavior of the students, and then the outcomes too, and really try to map out as thoroughly as possible everything that happened and the ideas that were germinating and driving and propelling all of those events. So it's been 3 years, and I'm about finished with a 24-episode documentary that lays out everything that I have except for the emails. There's just too many emails to read, but all the footage and trying to give a complete story to that. And I'm almost done with that, and I guess there's a lot of lessons to take from that, but maybe I should ask you, let you ask another question, because I just rambled for 10 minutes, didn't I?
No, that's really helpful framing, I think, for everybody. Yeah, I mean, I was also on campus at the time, and I can really attest to the tension that there was, and being between worlds of just like knowing that I had all these friends who were just absolutely compelled by the narrative that of the protests, and were calling Brett a racist and rallying around these things and living with anarchists. I mean, it was a really crazy and difficult time to be at Evergreen, to be at the center of all of this. So I guess I'm wondering about this contemporary situation that you're speaking to, kind of a rise, a new wave of maybe political activity. Is there any lessons that we can take from what happened at Evergreen that may apply to what you see happening today?
Well, I think that what you guys are doing here, I don't recall the words that you use, mimetic masochism or something like that.
Mediation.
Mediation. All right, I wasn't that far. After spending a great deal of time really investigating the Evergreen State College, the whole thing, I needed to branch out, because I kind of ended up with a YouTube channel, and it kind of turned into a very humble sort of source of income, and it was a business, and I was finally creating content and interacting with an audience, which is something that I really wanted to do. So I needed to branch out, and one of the things I ended up doing was interviews, because I wanted to bring to YouTube some content that I thought would be unique and that would be desirable, loosely following the interest of Jordan Peterson. Because Jordan Peterson was bringing an academic content to the YouTube that was already there, but he was kind of making it really popular, and he was turning a lot of people on to it, and in various levels of awareness and interaction and discourse. So I began to interview academics first, but then I kind of realized that, oh, well, I'm good at listening and asking the right questions, and I can get my interviewee to really open up and get into a different level of discourse. And eventually I started to interview individuals around, and this is going to get back to your question. I began to interview individuals that were trans, or who had transitioned their sex or their gender, or who had begun that process and then reverted from that process. And I began, and this is very ideal. Well, this is a very direct manifestation of the Evergreen way of learning, is that you choose a topic and you really get into it, and you really speak with people who are different from you, and you really try to just provide as a broad range of data into a topic and really get deep into it. And as I progressed in investigating gender, sexuality, and transition, I for whatever reason, I started to contact people in various different relationships to that topic. Feminists who I had been pretty strongly criticizing a certain brand of kind of contemporary op-ed criticism. I was pretty critical of that sort of feminism. But then I'm like, well, if I want to go further with understanding gender, I need to speak with women who have been thinking about gender and thinking about it in a different way than me. And so I began to speak with a broad range of feminists and researchers and sexuality. I got to speak with some of the top researchers in the field, and then a lot of young people too. And to get back to your question, what kind of initiated my interest in the transition gender topic was because I saw through what happened at Wilfrid Laurier University in the fall of 2017, where this TA, Lindsay Shepard, got, kind of gulagged a bit by her professors for showing a problematic Peterson clip. But I saw a lot of trans activists start to grandstand and use that as a way to shut down discourse and to become very authoritarian under the trans umbrella. And I saw at Evergreen that you have these activists who are taking the identity at the Evergreen State College of blackness or of being black, and then elect themselves as the representative of that group, and then, because they're operating on a group level and not an individual level, excuse any sort of behavior that's not civil, or not really take any responsibility for their behavior as individuals, because they're acting on behalf of some sort of large structural historical continuum that excuses, because of it excuses all their means in the pursuit of that ends. And I wanted to rescue not trans individuals, but rescue the trans discourse from the activists. I wanted to basically erode the activists' stranglehold on the conversation by speaking to people who weren't activists, but who were trans or detrans or researchers into this, and engage with that topic in such a way that the contentiousness wasn't involved in my form of discourse. My form of discourse was a lot more patient, a lot more long form, and a lot more human, and grounded in individuality, grounded in a personal narrative. And so that you can see, especially with feminists, especially the academic feminists who are who are thinking through things on an ideological level, you could see by engaging with them in an interview that all of their ideas were grounded in their experience. And so instead of having an argumentative discussion up here, we're having a human discussion that then branches off and grounds and has a circular dialogue with the ecosystem of lived experience, of being a human being, interacting through an identity and through a culture. So I think that is my basic tact to take the wind out of the sails of activism, and the racial tensions in America are very exhausting, and they were too much for me. And even to this day, it's a really fraught conversation. There's a lot of trauma and suffering, and a lot of like lower kind of very strong currents that are very difficult to deal with. And so I was kind of trying to take a break from that while still trying to wrestle with activism by going to a gender topic, which is not as fraught as the racial conversation that's going on.
Would, from your experience interviewing and meeting people, what would you say are like the tensions in the trans community, but inside of like from the individual perspective, rather than kind of the activist portrayal of what the issues are, but rather from the perspective of people in their lived experience?
The question's kind of self-defeating because we're either talking about the individual or we're talking about the community, and the way that I've gone about it, and I should say that I'm by no means an expert in gender and sexuality and transition at all. And my stance towards that topic is one of inquiry. I do have some opinions about activism, and I use and I mock the activist portion of the LGBTQ stuff. I talk on Twitter. I engage in that low-level discourse because I'm fighting against a certain way of framing that. But when you get out of that conversation and you go into, okay, what is it like to be a trans person, or what is it like to experience gender dysphoria? What is it like to be in such distress that it is a valid form of remedy of that distress to subject your body to some very intense, grueling, and permanent changes, and even tie yourself to a medical, a lifestyle that's afforded by a medical industry. Also, there's a big contingent, and this is very controversial. Studies suggest, and this is controversial, that there is a very strong, large wave of young people that are being convinced by their culture online or by internal sorts of understanding that they are in the wrong body. And they are, before the age of adulthood, attaching themselves to the medical industry. And they are, furthermore, through that medical industry, through the fields of psychology, through the fields of activism, they're being championed and rushed down this path that is that I don't really think a young person really understands what gender is. I don't even think most of us understand what gender is. I think that the whole conversation of what gender is has gone through such a rapid, radical reboot that we don't really even know what we're talking about anymore. So there's this contingent within the trans community they're derogatorily called true scum, or because they believe that in order to transition, in order to justify your transition, you need to have gender dysphoria. You need to have a very strong discordance between your perception and your physical reality. And that transition is rooted in that medical kind of black box of the brain not matching up with the body. And there's a lot of theories to that. There's this other contingent that's basically controlling the conversation right now that is acting on these theories about gender being a social construct that says that you don't need to transition to be trans. You don't need to have gender dysphoria to start to take testosterone if you're a female, or start to take estrogen if you're a male. It's kind of it's a weird phenomena that seems to be pre-transhumanism. It's where human beings are starting to use our technology to modify our bodies and our beings to match up with some sort of self-discovery. It's this taking of the ancient process of the hero's journey, let's say, or a spiritual process. There's a lot of similarities I see between ancient spiritual traditions and transition as it is enacted and spoken about within that the transgender community, as opposed to the transsexual community that's going on. That I have opinions on, but what I'm trying to do is give people access to thinking about it in a more nuanced and less urgent activist way of mode of engaging with that topic.
Can you speak a little bit more to the connection to the spiritual practices and the difference between the transsexual community and the trans community?
Yeah. Okay. Again, I just need it because this is going to go on YouTube. So I'm by no means an expert. This is just me investigating this kind of on the level of a hobby for a year and a half, and I'm just looking at it through a cultural kind of narrative. About a month ago, give or take, a article appeared in an Australian newspaper written by a mother about her female child, and her female child began to go on a hormone blocker that instigates menopause at an early age. This not fully sexually developed female was going on these hormones that were instigating menopause, and the mother was speaking about it in this really weird it was weird to me. She was speaking about it in a very celebratory way, that her son had self-discovered, and that the pain of this menopause was this connection with their true self and their true life. And it made me think about, there's still tribes and stuff, but there's a lot of ancient traditions where the youth, in order to become a member of the clan, in order to become an adult, is subjected to some sort of rigor, is subjected to some sort of public shaming, or you get whipped, or you get put into a box and you go through this death, or you confront this pain. And there was a lot of that unconscious mapping of this process of maturation this is contentious, but there was this mutilation involved that was representing for the mother the child becoming their true self, and there was this talk about authenticity. There's a lot of weird little triggers for me in the conversation that make it seem very kind of late stage commercialism, kind of you're choosing to be authentic. You're going to come to us as the doctors. We're going to make you understand who you really are. And I think that is very dangerous when we reduce our process of taking self-ownership, of discovering ourselves, of becoming more and more expansive. And instead of, I think about it, I think that the best way to go about that for my life is to become a master of something, and to pursue literature, let's say, or to be really good at my craft. That's how I unlock who I really am, is to produce something outside of me, or I do something in the world. This is this weird kind of individualistic, I become something, and I take the world and I shape myself into the image of what I believe I am at that moment, as though what you believe you are is a static construct, as though you can say, I know who I am. That is really dangerous, because it's not humble at all, and it's filled with hubris. And furthermore, you're enacting it with medications and with scalpels, right? And there's tribes that to this day, they do ritual scarring, or with regards to, I guess, genitals. The young males in certain cultures, their foreskins taken. Like there have been instances of surgical alteration that make a statement about belonging to a clan. But this is about belonging to yourself, and that ties into the really interesting currents within these online communities, in Tumblr and in Reddit, and these LGBT communities, where there's aspects in certain portions of these communities that lines up very much to cult-like behaviors, where you are love bombed and you're praised for going down this thing, and then you're stifled from asking questions. If you start asking questions in these communities, you begin to be policed in various ways. And I have to be very careful constantly and say, I'm not speaking about LGBTQ people themselves. I'm talking about certain manifestations within the culture that is using this identity to just recreate very old patterns of behavior, but not really being aware that it ties back. to these ancient things, like back to the garden of knowledge or whatever.
Great, thank you. And Peter, I see you have a question. Would you like to ask it?
Yeah, so it's a question about culture war, profiteering, and cancel culture. There's some people that there's an impression, at least amongst some tribes, that the people in the intellectual dark web and on those adjacent sort of responses, that they're profiteering off the culture war. And I think there's some charitable interpretations and uncharitable interpretations there. But I don't get the sense that you're doing it at all. And so I'm kind of curious if you can speak a little bit about that wave and vibe that's occurring as a reaction to social justice voices, and also cancel culture. Have you had any run-ins with the foot soldiers of cancel culture based off of the subject matter that you've been talking about?
Yeah, those are great big questions. The Grifter. Are you guys, I guess you can nod yes or no. Are you guys involved on Twitter? This is where, on Twitter, there's this perpetual accusation of being a grifter that goes around, and it affects all quadrants of the political compass, where it's kind of the outgroup deriding somebody who's acting in bad faith about a topic. And there's certain people where you wonder if they are actually grifting, and then there's certain people where it's really evident. And sorry to say this, but in my estimation, Candace Owens is very good at saying things that are very inflammatory, that get her a lot of play, but that don't really work out in actually forwarding understanding. It's more like making a concrescence around a tribe, or like reinforcing her status as the mouthpiece for an ideology. I think that it might be, it reminds me in a sense, it reminds me in a sense back when I was growing up in the 90s, late 90s, and I was like, I was in my early 20s, and I was an artiste, and I was really afraid of being called pretentious. I was very sensitive to being called pretentious, like I'm a pretender to making beautiful things. And I think that there is a certain level of self-inventory in being authentic, and if you do receive money for the product that you're giving off, that transaction is actually necessary to produce things, and to produce things that are in depth, and to produce things that have power. So tying your ideology or your ideological motivation to money doesn't necessarily invalidate the authenticity of what you're trying to do. For my own self, I've tried to not chase numbers, not chase being big, not really. There's an ego that's there, that's fine to be there. It keeps me abreast of what other people are doing. Am I doing good enough? Am I relevant? Am I playing the game in the right way? But my orientation is towards a kind of a longer run game. Like I want to enforce a form of dialogue that will last longer than the culture war with regards to how big and wavy it is. I do play that game. I do play the kind of the witty shit posting. I do that, and I don't not do that. I do that. But if you look just one step down, I have a number of different levels of discourse that I am engaging on. That if people see a viral tweet, they'll eventually see that I'm actually leading them down a path to a deeper level of discourse. So I'm trying to operate on different levels of discourse, and I think a grifter in the bad faith sense only ever enacts a certain form of very shallow, short-sighted discourse, and then makes a lot of, makes a living or a name for themselves up there, and doesn't really do any of that deep diving stuff. Cancellation culture is really interesting. I'm going to get canceled again, but I was canceled a couple months ago, and it was by the feminists. Because I had started speaking with feminists, and I got along with some of them. Some public feminists, Megan Murphy being one, who she got canceled literally by Twitter in 2018. But because I was following that line of inquiry, I started to do a lot of just platforming very strong feminist voices and platforming that side of the transgender debate, because there's this contention between the transgenderists and the gender critical feminists, and that's a whole mappy thing. And I was trying to map out the gender critical side. And I could do better with being fair with the transgender side, but they're really weird when they get into there. When they start actually exposing what they think, it's really weird stuff. So because I was shining a good light on the gender criticals, I got a lot of gender critical followers. And I said something about me being rational with regards to my intimate relationships and how the females that I'm intimate with help me with my emotions, and I help them with just thinking rationally. And I shouldn't have said that. I was kind of high on, I think it was whiskey and one of those pain pills, oxycodone, because I had a injury or something. So I shouldn't have said that, but that led to this huge pile on that was ironically really irrational, the way that they interacted with me. But over the last 6 months, I've had this run-in where a tweet or a statement will get a certain level of exposure and then expose me to a kind of ravenous movement against me, and recalibrating myself under that pressure has been really a growing experience to me, because when I'm not joking around, I'm doing these interviews, and when I'm doing the interviews, I'm working on a very emotionally sensitive level. Like I'm being very quiet and still in myself, and I'm allowing through that to get some very intimate, to capture some very intimate pictures or aspects of the people that I'm interviewing. But that being vulnerable also is not a good idea when you're receiving hate, because I'll really internalize that. So it's been really interesting to learn how to shield myself from certain sorts of negative energies that come at me, while still being able to accept or to receive the criticism, and then to process that into me being better at what I'm doing. So I will be canceled again. I'm trying to be cancel retardant in a way, by interacting in good faith with a number of people in a number of these different groups, so that if I get canceled by, let's say, the gender critical feminists, I will have some very big names in the gender critical community that will speak to me about that, or will have my back, right? So I'm trying to interact with people on an individual level, so that it's really hard to make me. What happened to Brett Weinstein was that he was turned into a cartoon of himself. I'm trying to resist that cartoonification of me in the light of being canceled, by being too complex and too weird or too multifaceted to be collapsed into that one little box that can be then, pilloried or forever stained as that one little thing.
That's good. Yeah. So the first part is like modeling good conversation for the long game. And then this one is just being human.
For the long game.
Yeah, for the long game. Yeah, like it.
At least like 70, 80 years, however much I'm given.
Walter, would you like to follow up with your question? Like, where are these coming from? The chat.
Oh, they're in the chat. I don't see.
Yeah.
Should
Yeah.
I?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, hey. I was just wondering, there's this argument that some of the less evidence-based, kind of weaker arguments that you see within some of these activist spheres are coming because there's sort of leftover institutional framework from perhaps the gay rights movement, where have you heard the term the iron law of institutions?
No.
It's basically a framework that says if an institution has been around for some time, eventually the actors within the institution become more focused on advancing the institution rather than the causes that the institution it was originally put in place for. So one argument might be that a lot of these wonderful old charities and nonprofits from the AIDS crisis are still around, and in order to retain donations, they have to look for new things to grow, and it's sort of like sort of a Moloch problem, as Scott Alexander would call it, sort of a self creating thing that, and then I wonder if that's maybe where some of the less good arguments might be coming from, just because it's not coming from the heart, it's coming from this big institutional monster.
Yeah. I think this is really fascinating to me on a sociological, philosophical, psychological level, on studying activists and studying what you're saying there. And one thing that I've noticed is that we have a lot of these institutions like the New York Times or let's say the ACLU that are going down this path of betraying some of the foundational principles of civil liberty, let's say, where the ACLU is championing some sort of Title X, certain modes of legalese that actually limit speech, that actually harm, preponderance of evidence, harm these ancient, these really old bedrock values that we have. And the New York Times does that too on an ideological level, or let's say within the boundaries of the gender critical, transgender discourse. You have major magazines like Science. It's just called Science. That's how sciencey it is. It's just called Science. They're like now saying that sex doesn't exist, that it's some sort of construct of the mind or something like that. And what I notice is that you have these institutions that are now helmed by people who are expending the authority. So the institution has over time gained all this authority by being authoritative, by acting in a behavior that's trustworthy, and now you have these individuals that are expending that in order to make certain gains. With regards to, let's say, the charity, I think it's a UK charity called Stonewall, which was founded on gay rights, and now, since gay marriage came through, you see them switch, and all this money goes directly into the transgender rights, and you see them now deleting tweets where they're saying that homosexuality is a biologically based attraction to the same sex, whereas now their official stance is that you can be a lesbian if you identify as a female. Like they're now going over to this weird it's just unreal why somebody would think that, or why these categories would be swapped about that, why we have allowed people to decouple the biological sex of what it is to be a woman and all the processes that a female goes through in her development, mentally, physically, all that stuff, plus all of the processes that a female goes through in her cultural development, all that stuff, which is a huge bundle of complexity and very strong, very excruciating and wonderful processes that are pre-ancient, and being able to take that category and then just make it not mean anything by just handing it over to whoever wants to identify into that. You can just elect yourself into that, and there's a number of different ways to react to that. I react to that because I think that it's slandering something that for me I conceive of as sacred. Like the female is sacred. It's something that's off limits that I need to compose myself towards, respect towards, because that is what caused me to have life, and that's what causes more life to exist. So just on a very foundational, I'm not talking individual women, I'm just talking on the concept of female is a very important category for me, because protecting that category ensures that I and that which follows from I persists through time. It's a very important category insofar as we are biological entities. But that is just eroded now for the sake of what? And one more kind of off-topic thought, or kind of tangential thought, is that the activist isn't there to be right. They're not there to pursue the truth. They're there to get their way. And and you can go through any sort of activist, I guess, group, and you can see rampant hypocrisy, where there's one statement and another statement that are made with the same amount of conviction and the same amount of power and the same amount of urgency, but if you put them together, they don't make sense. They don't make sense as a coherent whole, as a system of thought, but they only ever make sense in forwarding the activist's will. And once you see that truth, it goes all the way back to pre-Stoa times, right? It goes back to, Plato and Socrates, and you had Socrates going down one frame of discourse that's aiming towards, I guess, the good or the true, and then you have the sophists that are going down another course of discourse about gaining power, of persuading the populace to act in a certain way. And both of those frames of discourse, I think, need to come into harmony, because you have to have some sort of action from your thoughts. You have to follow your thoughts, and maybe Christianity tried to, in certain forms, harmonize those two things in that discourse around faith and works. Like, you need to have the right faith, which is orthodoxy, and then the right practice, orthopraxy, and trying to bring those two in alignment. But it has to check out, and you'll see that they'll switch discourse in order to keep you off center, in order to maintain their control. There's a lot of judo going on, and that happens in any given discourse when the volume and the temperature is turned up. And so what I think that we need to do is constantly kind of turning the temperature down, or providing a lot of cool-headed behavior where that high radioactive level of very reactive activist kind of discourse really doesn't make any sense, because everybody's kind of calm and like talking through things rationally. But when you have these institutions that are forwarding this agenda, who furthermore have all this money going on behind it, furthermore you have these psychologists and these doctors that are acting in a way that I don't think is proper towards young children, and putting them on a path of sterility and of confusion and of, sorry to say, in certain cases, I think you could argue mutilation for the rest of their lives, according to a dogma that is really hot right now, but in 10 years might not be as hot anymore, might not be the thing to want to become when you're a teenager. That is a terrible tragedy, and that's something that I kind of get up in arms about.
Thank you. Maybe, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Something that I heard you say in sort of your introduction was that a big part of what concerns you is about this sort of medicalization of our re-understanding of gender that's clearly been triggered at this like kind of cultural moment. I do see like this really concerning thing where it was not very long ago that the wellness industry was offering conversion therapy to what they saw as like confused homosexuals who were suffering a mental illness. And now the same community who had to live through that, which is just horrible, it is giving so much trust to the same industry to help them carry out something that is, potentially as transformative without questioning whether it's as harmful. And I also hear you speak to the idea that sexuality and physicality and gender have been spiritual concepts for as long as they've been biological concepts. And the wellness industry is trying to sort of fill both gaps right now in ways that you don't sound like you think are necessarily always appropriate. And I would really like to hear more about your concerns about the medicalization and the lack of like spiritual support to counter it or question it.
Am I hearing? Oh, okay. There's one of my regular guests is a licensed professional counselor, I believe. She works specifically with gender questioning youth or young people who are really wrestling with the concepts of gender. And her name's Sasha Ayad, and some of my best content is in our discussions about this topic, because one of the things that she really stresses is that youth today, especially females, but males as well, because of, let's say, internet. Because of the internet, because of the disembodied sexuality that's performed upon the internet, they are coming into an understanding of sex that is through the head and not through the body. So there's this whole generation who discovers sex through videos and through sounds and lights and devices. These things that are made out of metal and plastic and stuff. And what does that do to one's sexuality? What does that do to, let's say, a female who says, oh, that is what I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be treated that way. That is what sex is. Or, and not even that, but there's this whole disembodied aspect of, oh, I should be pansexual. I should be homosexual. What is my sexuality? And you talk, I've spoken with a number of young women, probably in their 20s, more or less, who go through that, who talk about like the last 10 years of their development and not even really desiring other people. Like there's no real eros. There's no real, I love that, or like I'm turned on by that immediacy, that physicality is gone, and it's all replaced by this abstracted form of sex where it's not human. It's not even biological anymore. It's this game, the shadowy game. So you see that level of disassociation happening on such a profoundly personal activity of sexuality and desire. Like that which pre-internet is something that you discovered, like out on the town, or like you kind of fumbled your way through it, and that fumbling too now, like with the post Me Too era and Me Too. I want to separate that from the rampant disregard and harassment and oppression of females based on their sex by men based on their sexuality. I want to abstract that from that into that cultural artifact of the conversation around consent. When I was at the Evergreen State College, one of the orientations that you go through is about consent. And it's like, in order for me to have a spontaneous sexual interaction, I need to like bring out this 5-page manual on all these different line items that we need to sign and verbalize. And then every 5 minutes I need to ask permission. Are you okay? And all of that quiet meditation between one individual discovering another individual is colonized by the brain, is colonized by the mind, is colonized by legalese, is colonized by all these repercussions. And not to say that consent isn't absolutely necessary in order for respectful adult sexual intercourse to occur, but there is a way that's gone about it that's so clinical and has a lot of what you're talking about the wellness industry, a lot of this kind of dissociated from reality kind of clinical like separation, and where does that leave emotional development? How do you develop a full human understanding of yourself and other people as human beings if it's all mediated through, on one level, pornography, on another level, this consent culture, and then this not to deride anybody who's on Tinder, but like that commodification of interpersonal interactivity. It's an exchange of pleasure. It's an exchange of pleasure. And I think that we're watching. I think we forget that we're in the middle of a cultural experiment where the 60s came through and introduced a lot of liberation, so-called, and we are now kind of living through successive generations of more and more liberatory behavior. And then how that is managed, how do we bring order into that chaos it's a big question. And how do we do that? How do we make communities? How do we facilitate young men and women to go through a profound amount of development and understand the consequences of sex as another human being, which I think is a really big point that we overlook when we talk about sexuality. That's how we all got here, so maybe that should be reason for us to respect it a little bit, and to leave some amount of religious kind of awe in the face of that when we intellectualize it.
Thank you. Thank you, maybe, for that question. I want to do a call out, see if there's any more questions before we kind of wrap up here. Anybody else? Peter? I think,
can't tell if these are questions or statements in a lot of these.
yeah, I know.
I think Nominus might have had a question, or no.
I think there's a lot of expression about the difficulty of talking about this stuff that's happening in the chat, and also the difficulty of being gender nonconforming in this context, and kind of talking about all of the complexity of these issues. And I don't know if you have anything you'd like to say about just speaking on these things. And
Well, I think that I peppered my conversation with enough apology or cancellation retardants of kind of contextualizing. I can only speak from my experience. I do have a place in my heart for old ideas that are thoroughly outmoded, and I justify that because by way of saying that I'm dealing with gender on a spectrum of different levels of the concept of what a male and a female is. And I think that it starts on a very rudimentary mythological level, and then it goes all the way up into a modern level where you interact with somebody who's gender non-conforming, or you interact with somebody who is female but very masculine, or who's male but very feminine, and seeing all of those ideas play out in a human being. Seeing all those ideas, allowing for those concepts to interact on an individual level, not as enforcements of a stereotype, but as a sort of expression of these very deep patterns of biology and psychology that are emerging through us as individuals. And every individual is a mixture of all these different concepts. And to be able to interact with the stereotype and the archetype and and to kind of section that off to how I interact with an individual goes back into what I've been wrestling with regards to the racial discourse, with regards to any sort of identitarian discourse. Like, how do you hold onto yourself as a human being and as a man and and then as Benjamin, like, how do you go through all those different and contain all those different categories and not let the category corrupt the individual, but not to think that the individual is so free of category that the category doesn't actually exist anymore. Yeah, there's a lot of wiggle room, but that doesn't mean that those categories don't have a very strong foundation. And to deny those categories and deny the exploration of those categories is to cut ourselves off from certain knowledge that will reproduce itself in patterns of behavior over and over and over again, because we can't escape that. We're not at the point where we can just unplug from the body and upload ourselves into the mind, or into the network. We're not at that point yet. So I try to model humility while it's still having the courage to take a position, and then be wrong, and then to allow for people to show me where I'm wrong, and so that they can have their ideas voiced.
yeah, thank you. Thank you for modeling that with your project and for bringing all of these things here to us today. It is a really important conversation to be having, and it's so difficult. It's really helpful to have like role models and some ideas about what we can do to actually begin to open up these questions. So I just have a lot of gratitude for what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Peter, would you like to
do you guys
close
end
out?
with like a song?
We do
for these
but,
things. Do you?
That's after we stop pressing record and we start singing to you. Just to echo Raven's thoughts, so Ben and I have belonged to this podcasting mastermind group for a while now, and I've always been really, really impressed with you, and just engaging in these topics and the way you engage with them. So, just keep what you're doing, man. And thanks for coming on. Thanks, Raven, for emceeing, and everyone for the excellent questions. Next events tomorrow, we got maybe Gray, who's in the room. Maybe do you want to just do another shout out to what we have stored for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it actually ties in a lot with the sort of concepts that we talked about today. I'm going to be talking about how OnlyFans has kind of exploded and is all over the internet. Talking about like why pornography might be a big thing during COVID and what that says about our relationships to our sexuality, especially like under social distancing circumstances. And I hope I can like chat a lot in a way that destigmatizes the longing that we're still feeling for each other, and like just celebrate that we still desire to connect with each other, and maybe like pull out some of these identitarian issues that we have with talking about our experiences of attraction and gender and sex and all of that kind of great stuff.
Yeah, love that. It's going to be a juicy session. And then the same day, we have Daniel Schmachtenberger, Sense-Making Mensch, and that's at, what time is it? 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Check out the Wisdom Gym. There's more events. Daniel Thornson's Welcome Back Party. It's going to be posted, and that's going to be on Monday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, so that's going to be really, really fun. Check out the Stoa, www.thestoa.ca for events, sign up for their mailing list, and the Stoa is based off a gift economy, reviewing as a gift in this time of need. If you're inspired to give a gift to the Stoa, just check out the gift economy information. All right, everyone. Thank you.